Hello and welcome to Timeless with Julie Hartman. It is Wednesday, November 20th, 2024. I'm Julie Hartman, and it is great, as always, to be with you. Now, yesterday I guest hosted for the Dennis Prager show while Dennis has, of course, been out because of his back injury, and I had the opportunity to interview someone who I have admired for so long. He is a fearless exposer of the Chinese Communist Party and a staunch advocate of the United States of America, as well as an expert on all matters pertaining to foreign policy. It is Gordon Chang. Now, we talked at the very beginning of the interview about a recent development in the Russia-Ukraine war, which is something for all of us to really keep a close eye on. Over the past few months, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, who we shall not forget was once referred to by President Biden in his dwindling days of his campaign as President Putin, and then President Biden goes, "President Putin, I'm so concerned about beating President Putin that I accidentally called President Zelensky President Putin." Anyway, President Zelensky of Ukraine said in the past few months that it is a new component of Ukraine's victory strategy for them to go inside of the Russian interior and shoot conventional weapons inside of the Russian interior. In other words, they no longer just want to push back the Russian army as the Russian army advances from the eastern side of the country towards the west. They want to go inside of Russia and exact some losses there. On August 6th of this year, Ukraine did just that. They went into the Kursk region of Russia, which borders Ukraine, and they used weapons to dismantle some bridges, to exact some villages. And in response, two very important things happened. Number one, President Putin of Russia said that if the United States gives Ukraine, and that's what we've been doing because Ukraine doesn't have the capacities to do this by itself, if the United States gives Ukraine more conventional weapons for them to use inside of the Russian interior, he, President Putin, will consider it a direct act of warfare by the United States and NATO on Russia. That Kursk incursion was the first attack inside of the Russian interior since World War II. And so Putin has not minced his words about this. He said that this would be a transformation of the conflict by, in his view, making the United States directly involved. That's the first important thing. Oh, and by the way, on top of that, as if those words were not draconian enough, the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, said that it would be a, quote, suicide mission for the United States to allow Zelensky to do this. That's the first important thing. The second important thing is after that August Kursk invasion, North Korea, at the beck and call of Russia, sent its troops into Kursk in order to push back the Ukrainian military. And they have indicated that they would like to use North Korean troops in more areas than just that. And so what we saw yesterday is that President Biden, after months of hesitation, approved Ukraine to use conventional weapons. He sent Ukraine more conventional weapons. And yesterday, Ukraine carried out another attack in a bordering region inside of Russia. And so this leaves a lot of questions about what is going to happen. If the president of Russia has pledged that this would be a direct act of war, if the foreign minister has said this would be a suicide mission, if North Korea was brought into this conflict after an earlier iteration of what we saw, what are we left to believe about where this will go? Doesn't portend very well for the future. And so what people need to understand, I believe, in the United States, and then we're going to go to Gordon Chang, is that this conflict, especially now, is no longer, and really has never been, a Ukraine wins the war or Russia wins the war. Since Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014 and took parts of the Donbass, which is the eastern region, which is now basically controlled by Russia, as well as Crimea, Putin has had a foothold in the region. Now, back in 2014, we didn't see any Ukraine flags being waved, or at least not to the extent that they are now. We didn't see the kind of uproar about Ukraine as we see now. And now people are saying, oh my gosh, when President Trump comes into office, he's going to bow down to this terrible dictator, Putin. He's going to have some kind of deal where there's going to be a compromise. We even heard in the presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump back in September that David Muir asked the question to Donald Trump about Ukraine. He said, "Sir, do you believe it is in the United States' best interest to win this war, yes or no?" As if it was that simple. As if the war was just Ukraine wins and Russia loses. It's not that simple. And especially, it is not that simple now. So I hope you enjoy this interview with Gordon Chang. As I said, he is so keen on the facts pertaining to foreign policy, and he is a China expert. And make no mistake, China and Russia are heavily allied. And China has a hand both in this war and the war in Gaza. So hope you enjoy this interview, and I'll see you soon. Mr. Chang, are you there?
I'm here.
Oh, good. Well, it's funny because whenever I bring on people on the air to discuss communist China and some of its accomplices, including Russia, I always find that right at the moment that I bring them on, we seem to encounter technical difficulties.
Well, this time that's not my fault.
Well,
thank you.
It seems it reeks a little bit of interference, a cynic would say. We have about a minute until we have to go to welcome our affiliates, but I'm curious how you view this most recent development in the Russia-Ukraine war and how you may see China and Russia's alliance being affected by this.
Certainly, China has supported Russia in regarding the ATACMS, the missiles that you're talking about. And they've said this is an escalation. But we got to remember that President Biden said that he would have to do something, in specifically allowing Ukraine to fire ATACMS into Russia if the Russians brought in the North Koreans, which is exactly what Russia has done. There are now about 12,800 North Korean soldiers. And these are not cannon fodder. These are special operators. And so they're North Korea's best. And there's some talk that North Korea would add to this 12,800. So clearly we're at a point where we had to do something. And this is what President Biden chose.
That's right. And few Americans understand that these powers, China, Russia, North Korea, and I would even add Iran, are very much aligned with one another through political alliances, through economic alliances, and especially aiding each other through these wars. Now, as I mentioned, you are a China expert, and I believe that China is the grand master pulling a lot of the strings that we're seeing.
China has been supplying almost all-in support to the Russians. Remember, on February 4th, 2022, Vladimir Putin, when he was in Beijing, issued the joint statement with China that declared their all no-limits partnership, where they said no type of assistance would be prohibited. And since then, we have seen China actually finance the war effectively with its elevated commodity purchases. It's provided diplomatic and propaganda support. Also, China's been providing lethal assistance to Russia from the very beginning of this conflict. And I believe that China masterminded the relationship between North Korea and Russia, where the North Koreans are supplying artillery shells, short-range ballistic missiles, artillery pieces, as well as those soldiers that we talked about, 12,800 of North Korea's finest soldiers. So China has been very much behind this, and I believe that they are happy to see the North Koreans in Russia because they believe at this point that Russia must win this because China and Russia are working cooperatively to destabilize the international situation.
As I indicated a few moments ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin has promised that if the United States would allow the Ukrainians to shoot conventional weapons into the interior, it would mean nothing less than a direct act of warfare on the part of the United States and NATO countries on Russia. How do you anticipate Putin and his ally, Xi Jinping, might react to what we saw this morning? Ukraine, in fact, carrying out another offensive, shooting conventional weapons into the interior.
Well, Russia has done everything it possibly can except use its tactical nuclear weapons. So I'm not sure that there's going to be much of a conventional response. Russia's been struggling with this war, which is the reason why the North Korean soldiers are there. And so I think the threat is hollow. The question is whether he will actually use tactical nukes. I suspect he won't, but there's always the possibility of that. We got to remember, a lot of people say taking off the limits on the use of the attack of missiles is dangerous. Yes, it is, but that's not a meaningful objection, because at this point, every course going forward is dangerous. And I believe that the course that we have adopted so far, which has been one of restraint, has allowed Putin first to invade and then to engage in barbarous acts. So we are at a point where we've lost the initiative. Biden lost the initiative starting from the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan, which means right now we're in a very, very dangerous world.
Turning now to the head of that very dangerous world, China, we know that China has endeavored to infiltrate and subvert the United States for some decades now. They buy farmland next to our military bases. They have a spy base on Cuba. They commit an act of warfare by making and manufacturing the fentanyl, which kills 75,000 Americans a year. They have bought off many of our top leaders, including the President of the United States. You are obviously an expert on China. Your book, again, is Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. I'm curious, how would you characterize the situation in China today compared to 5 years ago when Donald Trump was president?
Well, with regard to China's external behavior, it certainly is much more belligerent. Trump, on January 20, 2021, left Joe Biden a peaceful and stable world. And Biden's policies, I think, have opened the door to Russian aggression, certainly in Ukraine. We've seen China and Russia destabilize North Africa by fielding insurgencies that look like wars. We know that China has been behind Iran's assault on Israel. So although Biden's policies, when he articulates them, sound like they should work, they sound responsible, nonetheless, they have certainly contributed to a disastrous situation, which means that we need to do something different. Now, I'm not saying that something different is going to work, especially at this late stage, but if we don't try something different, we know that the current policies are going to result in even more calamity. So we got to understand we may not have a good solution here. You cannot have misguided policies since the end of the Cold War and not expect that we will be able to get out of this without cost.
I want to follow up on something that you just said. I don't want to let it slip by. It's very important. You said that China was behind Iran and Hamas's attack on October 7th in Israel. What is the evidence for that?
Well, first of all, again, it's elevated commodity purchases. So last year, China took more than 90% of Iran's exports of crude oil. The volume of that was 60% above that in 2017. 2017 is relevant, Julie, because that is the last year before the Trump administration reimposed sanctions on the purchase of Iranian oil. But it's certainly much more because there's been diplomatic and propaganda support. Iran has components for its weapons come from China. For instance, Iran doesn't make computer chips. The computer chips in Iran's weapons come from China. And also, Iran's main proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthi militia, have large quantities of Chinese weapons. They also have large quantities of North Korean weapons, and North Korea could not sell them to Iran without China's approval. We saw on July 23 of this year, the 14 Palestinian groups, they met in Beijing. They signed the Beijing Declaration. That shows you that China's involvement in this war has been deep and comprehensive. And so we should be holding China responsible for the attack on Israel. The fact that we don't hold China responsible for anything means that the leaders in Beijing think they can do whatever they want.
I have to say I can't say I'm happy to hear this, but I'm a little bit encouraged because I wrote a article which many publications rejected actually about a year ago, positing that China and its accomplice Russia were likely behind the October 7th massacre in Israel. So to hear from you, the expert, that there is overwhelming evidence for that, I'm happy that my original contention was correct.
It certainly was correct, Julie.
So Donald Trump is going to take office in less than 100 days. How do you anticipate these alliances, that is, again, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, would be affected by a second Trump administration?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have a little bit evidence of that so far because just before our November 5th election and continuing through now, China has been uncharacteristically quiet in its peripheral seas and airspace, which I think is an indication of a couple things. There's some internal reasons for it, but primarily I think China has been quiet, and this is really, really unusual. I think it's because they want to give Donald Trump a very wide berth. They're worried about what he might do. They know he's unpredictable. They know they can't control him, and they can't certainly figure out what he's going to do next. So I think that China has decided to lay low. I don't know how long this will last, Julie, but clearly it is very welcome that the Chinese provocations have just disappeared this month.
Do you anticipate that there might be a blockade surrounding Taiwan or, God forbid, an all-out invasion?
The authorities in Taiwan have been telling visiting foreigners for at least a month now that they expect China to impose a quarantine within the next 3 or 4 months. And that means there's going to be trouble. Now, a quarantine is technically not an act of war, but in these circumstances, it probably would lead to a blockade, which is an act of war, and it could even lead to a shooting conflict. So there is a lot of danger in that. I just hope that the election of President Trump is delaying China's plans to quarantine Taiwan, because once they do that, I think they start a series of events that they may not be able to control. And the other factor here is that inside the Chinese political system right now, only the hostile answers, actually even only the most hostile answers, are considered to be acceptable, which means that Xi Jinping can't back down if he does something.
Gordon Chang, it has been so nice to have you on the program. Thank you so much for all of the incredible information that you provide to us. There are so few people who are relaying to us the threats that Communist China pose, and I commend you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Julie. I really appreciate talking to you.
And as a reminder, Mr. Chang's book is Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. Take care. I look forward to talking with you soon, Mr. Chang.
Thank you, Julie. I do too.
Thanks so much for listening. And before you go, I want to quickly tell you about MyPillow. I use a lot of MyPillow products, including, you guessed it, the pillow, the bed sheets, the slippers, the towels. And now you can get many of these products at a massive discount if you use the promo code Hartman. For instance, you can get the standard classic MyPillow available for just $14.88. That's a savings that's too good to pass up. You can also take home their 4-piece kitchen set for only $25. Enjoy their new mattress topper starting at just $99.99. And pick up the luxurious MyPillow bed sheets starting at just $49.98. Just go to mypillow.com or call 1-800-566-6745 and use the promo code Hartman to unlock huge discounts. Don't miss out. Order today. Again, go to mypillow.com or call 1-800-566-6745 and use the promo code Hartman. Take care, everyone. I'll see you soon.